Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Karen Johnson, who's an award-winning Professor of Environmental Engineering at Durham University. Welcome to the podcast, Karen.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And I have to say, Karen's also my life partner of over 30 years, and I have never been more nervous about how a podcast might go. But with the upsurge in interest in nature-based solutions, I thought it was a good time to get Karen on to talk about the role of soil in the carbon cycle and climate change, because this is going to be absolutely vital if we're to make progress. But as usual, I like to start at the beginning. And Karen, how did you first get involved in this?
Okay, I'm very passionate about soil, but I haven't always been, I suppose, is the honest answer. I started off looking at water treatment. So I did my PhD with Paul Younger at Newcastle University, and we used nature-based solutions to treat mine water that was full of metals. Then I realised that the waste product from that water treatment process, which was using waste bits of gravel, etc., to treat the water, was actually covered in very valuable minerals that the soil would benefit from. So I started to look at using waste as resources to treat contaminated land. Then I moved away from contaminated land, because I realised what I was adding to the soil was minerals and organic matter, and it was having a bigger effect than the sum of the parts. So I was seeing an improvement in soil function, the way soil provides us with services like holding onto water, holding onto carbon, and growing plants and more nutritious plants. And that's when I realised, that's because soil is living, and I'm providing the living soil with things that it needs in order to provide more services for us and the microbiome.
And in 2016, you gave evidence at the government's Soil Health Inquiry. It was the Environmental Audit Committee. Was that one of the first times our government really looked at soil, do you feel?
I think it was, because we had noticed that before this inquiry, which we lobbied very hard for, before this inquiry, we noticed that there was a white paper on the environment, there was a white paper on agricultural policy and on food, and none of them mentioned soil. So this is why we spoke to various chairs of the Environmental Audit Committee and eventually ended up working with Mary Cray, who ran the Soil Health Inquiry.
And how did you feel it went in terms of, was it taken seriously? Did you get a good outputs from it? Did it achieve what you wanted to achieve?
It achieved what we wanted to achieve in terms of raising soil up the political agenda, and thankfully Ellen Fay founded the Sustainable Soils Alliance out of that Soil Health Inquiry. So there was a lot of passion in the government actually from various MPs for soil at that time. I think in terms of, has it affected change in terms of how we actually care for soil and look after soil? It's difficult to make a link, but there has been an increase in interest in soil with regenerative agriculture taking off. But I think that we can't attribute that to the Soil Health Inquiry. But certainly in the UK, politicians now are a little bit more aware of soil because of that first Soil Health Inquiry.
And then rounding out your CV, in 2023, you were awarded the Royal Society's Rosalind Franklin Award. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so that was very much a team effort, as all of these things are. It should be noted that when you get given a prize, usually many prizes, you actually have to apply for them, and there's a lot of hard work that goes in from your team to do that. So the prize was given because I came up with a really good idea for how to engage more women in engineering. And that was, I've noticed throughout my career that in general, stereotyping massively obviously, but women are more interested in engineering because of the holistic side of engineering, global challenges, sustainability. So we decided that soil health, which is very much a holistic view of soil, and a lot of engineers struggle with the concept of soil health. We always called it soil quality, which was much more quantitative. Soil health was possibly a way to engage primary school children, which is the time you have to engage children to get them to think about going to university and raise their aspirations. We thought if we had a set of primary school lessons which taught people about soil health and how engineers must look after and protect soil, then those children might be more likely to go into engineering because of for holistic reasons, sustainability reasons. So we're going to monitor it and see. It's going to, again, it's a very longitudinal study and hard to see if we've had an effect, but we will understand if they have learned about soil and that they want to care for soil more. And then hopefully they'll want to do engineering to care for soil as well, because that's where engineering is moving.
Fantastic. And let's move on to the question I asked you a couple of weeks ago, which sort of inspired this episode of the podcast, which was a very simple one, is how is carbon held in soil?
Okay, so probably best to take a step back and think about what soil is. So if you imagine a pie diagram, where you have half of the pie diagram is the solid components of soil, which is the minerals, things like iron oxide, rust, silica dioxide, sand, and a little bit of that half of the pie chart is soil organic matter or carbon, organic carbon. The rest of the pie chart is air and water. So those are the four non-living components of soil. And carbon, the organic carbon, and part of the inorganic carbon in the minerals is an important part of soil. But the most important part of soil is the living microbiome and mesofauna, meaning little beasties that we can hardly see with the naked eye, and then the macrofauna, the worms, etc. That's what actually makes soil soil. And this is where the carbon comes in. It's organic carbon, which is their food source. Mm-hmm. So we have three things, as far as we're aware, controlling carbon in the soil and carbon storage. The first one most people will have heard of is photosynthesis. That's called the biological carbon pump. So that's where plants are taking the sun's energy and combining carbon dioxide and water into sugars. Mm-hmm. So that the plants can grow. But what most people don't know is that the soil microbiome, which is analogous, we can talk about this, to our gut microbiome, the soil microbiome is dependent on the plants for their organic matter as well, for their food, for their carbon. And actually, of the carbon that is made in plants, the sugars that are made in plants that of course we eat, about 40% of that is given out by the roots to the soil microbiome in exchange for minerals, some micronutrients and some macronutrients that the plants can't access through photosynthesis. So things like phosphorus and zinc and copper, things that we need very small amounts of, are provided by the microbiome in a two-way exchange. So the plants give them sugar to eat, and the microbes share the micronutrients with the plants. And that's a symbiotic relationship. So that's the biological carbon pump. The other two methods of storing carbon in the soil are the microbial carbon pump, where basically, because the microbes are getting fed from diverse planting, and we can come back to that if you're interested in diversity in planting, then the microbes obviously grow, and that, what's called necromass, which is the dead bodies of microbes, can sometimes be trapped in soil particles and is a store of carbon. Mm-hmm. But the third pump, as it were, as opposed to the biological carbon pump and the microbial carbon pump, is the mineral carbon pump. Mm-hmm. And this is a really exciting one for engineers, because we can add minerals to soil. So these are particles of rock, basically. Mm-hmm. And when we look at the fast carbon cycle, which is the stuff that is turned over very quickly in the soil by the microbiome and by plant roots, that is not attached to minerals. The slow carbon cycle, where carbon is stored in the soil for tens of years, decades, and hundreds of years, is where the carbon is attached to minerals, chemically attached to minerals.
Right. Come on to that a little bit more in a second. But as I understand it, and I've done a little bit of swatting up on this, is that soil is by far the biggest terrestrial store of carbon 80% is the figure that I
It
dug
is
out.
the biggest store of organic carbon. So again, to get technical, organic carbon means things made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur. It's the stuff we eat. It's the stuff the soil microbiome eats. It's the stuff plants make through photosynthesis. The biggest store of carbon after fossil fuels is inorganic carbon in the oceans, which is calcium carbonate, the rock, limestone basically, but in a dissolved form.
Yeah. And there's two real interests that I think people listening to this or watching this will be of particular interest in. One is how to reduce carbon emissions from land use changes, which, you know, I know the figures vary, but I've seen quotes saying 25 to 33% of climate change has been caused by land use change rather than the rest by fossil fuels. Obviously still the majority, but a significant amount comes from soil. And then how to reverse that process to try and absorb carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So we've recently had a COP, another COP. You know, we had the COP on climate change, we had the COP on biodiversity, and then we had a COP on desertification, and it didn't do very well either from the sounds of things. But you know, how is carbon lost to the atmosphere from soil?
So carbon is lost from soil when we don't look after soil, we don't care for soil. And we have had decades now, over 70 years, of educating the world that soil is just a media to grow plants in. It doesn't do anything for the plants. We just add chemical nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, perhaps some micronutrients if the plant is showing a micronutrient deficiency, but we never believed that soil was delivering anything more than a support system for the plants, a physical support system. Now we know very definitely that it's actually the living material in soil, the soil microbiome, that is in charge of all soil health. So this is where the analogy with human health comes in. And people are more familiar with the concept that human health is quite difficult to define, but that there are some things we can measure, like blood pressure, we can measure people's mental well-being, we can measure what their BMI is, you know, and we can debate how useful these metrics are. We're at the same stage with soil health. It's really hard to measure the health of a system that is dependent on a microbiome. So human health is dependent on the gut microbiome, and equally dependent on what we feed that gut microbiome. So hence all the discussion about prebiotics, the food that is good for our microbiome. And soil health is dependent on the soil microbiome. The reason why soil is degraded and giving off carbon emissions, or not holding on to carbon in the first place, is because we have treated soil like a non-living, abiotic, we would say, medium, and it is not. It's very much living. So even a very degraded soil will have some life in it, and certainly it's possible to kickstart that life, to restart that life by feeding the soil microbiome. So the 30 a week that we're meant to eat for our gut health, it would be similar for soil. If we can have diverse planting so that we're getting different forms of carbon being fed to the soil, that encourages a range of soil bacteria to thrive and flourish. And then they can provide the plants with the micronutrients as long as the right minerals are present in the soil, which depends on the geology of the soil. But of course, we can actually add new minerals to the soil if we need to. So what we need to do is restore that symbiotic relationship between plant and soil. And actually we know now from some of the work that's going on in Durham, incredibly exciting work by Steve Chivasa, that a lot of the plant genes, which we always believed, because plant genetics is a big area of research, we always believed that they were switched on by environment. We didn't understand that part of that environment was the soil microbiome. We now know that soil microbiome is responsible for literally switching on genes such as drought resilience. Very exciting. So soils are all different all around the world, even all around your region where you live, they will be different. So we need to think about what is needed to help that microbiome flourish. If we feed the microbiome, then the microbiome, which creates healthy soil, literally sticking together the sand, the silt and the clay particles into that lovely crumb. When you feel a healthy soil, that's been created by the living soil, by the microbiome, in conjunction with the macrofauna that live in the soil and the mesofauna. If we feed the microbiome what it needs, and that's carbon and micronutrients, through adding minerals and organic matter to the soil, then we will hold on to the carbon, because we'll have a good soil structure. And soil structure is at the heart of all ecosystem services, we call them, the things that soil does for us for free, basically.
Yeah. And obviously there's been a big interest in everything from regenerative farming through to rewilding. And all those practices are designed to try and retain or capture more soil organic carbon, if I'm correct. Correct me if I'm wrong. But, you know, do we have any feel for how much those can help?
That's the difficulty. If you read one paper, it'll say something different to another paper. So I think it's in order to reach net zero by 2050, it's something like 10 gigatons of carbon we have to extract from the atmosphere. And soil can help there, but very much there's a growing consensus within the soil health community that it should be carbon for soils, not soils for carbon. So there are a lot of industries looking at carbon credits from soil, and there's currently EU system, certification system coming through, which should make the system more statutory rather than voluntary, which means you're meant to have a little bit more confidence in the fact that the carbon is going to be held within the soil.
And that's how to sample and measure carbon across, say, a field or a piece of land. Yes,
because in reality, soil, you pick up one piece of soil in which there's billions of bacteria, by the way, and because there's billions of bacteria, that handful of soil will be different to this handful of soil. It's very, what we call heterogeneous. It's different each bit you sample. So coming up with that mechanism of identifying and baselining how much soil carbon is there at the minute and how much will be there if you change practices is really difficult and fraught with risk. Doesn't mean to say we shouldn't do it, but I think that many people are considering more process-led systems as opposed to the be-all and end-all being how much carbon you measure. If we know that people are undertaking regenerative farming, which we have to give farmers a sense of responsibility for giving them a bit of flexibility because they know their land, we can't hard baseline and evidence everything. We can't say you must do this and have that regulation being the same for all farmers, even within the northeast. We've got so many different soil types, so we need a bit of flexibility in the processes that people can use in order to achieve overall a good result. And we can't be wrapping the knuckles of people who don't always achieve carbon as long as they're doing the right thing. This is quite a strong feeling within the soil health community, I think.
Yeah, as well as increasing the carbon holding capacity of the soil, there are other co-benefits of these measures as well. Absolutely.
So if you do carry out the processes that increase soil carbon, such as less tillage, more diverse planting, possibly if you're missing minerals from your soil, adding minerals to the soil that can stabilise the soil and hold it in there, then you're going to see, you're going to reap many benefits. So you're going to see increases in improvements in soil structure, which mean that the soil can hold on to water better, so that aligns with drought resilience in our summers and flood resilience in our winters. We also see improvements in soil biodiversity if we have healthier soils. In general, it's a bit of a complicated relationship between carbon and biodiversity because there's only so much carbon to go about. But those improvements are also nature-based improvements that we want to see in our society. A healthy soil is one that's good for humans as well. So literally touching a healthy soil, particularly a forest-based soil, is really good for your immune system, and there's a growing body of evidence about that. Which links into the hygiene hypothesis, that we are too clean, we don't touch soil enough these days. So yeah, many co-benefits that need to be taken into account, and I think there's a gap in the market there to look at co-benefits of some of these nature-based solutions.
Yeah. And we've talked about sort of alternative agriculture and rewilding, but two other things that keep coming up. One is, the first one you hinted at before is enhanced rock weathering. Can you talk us through that?
Yes, so enhanced rock weathering is a natural process. Basically, if you've got silicate-based minerals, they weather with acidic rain, which has got a bit of carbon dioxide dissolved in it, carbonic acid. They weather and absorb carbon dioxide, basically, because of the calcium content of those minerals. And so companies have looked at adding basalt and other silicate-based minerals to soil. Now, at first I was quite suspicious of this technology because I'm very much against reusing wastes. A lot of the waste that we produce in our society are actually resources for soil, and it's actually over half of everything we put to landfill is clean soil, which is a figure that people are often shocked about. So this is from the mining industry, enhanced rock weathering, but it is a waste product from the mining industry. In general, when we're mining, quarrying, basalt and other silicate rich rocks, then we have a waste pile which is very fine material, which has a high surface area to volume ratio, and that's what these companies are adding to the soil. I think they're having the same difficulty as the organic carbon market is, in terms of showing that there has been carbon sequestration. So it's a bit different. Organic carbon, it's about keeping it in the soil, sticking it to minerals. The minerals that the enhanced rock weathering people are adding are actually pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but they're doing it very, very slowly. And so what I think that industry is looking at, excitingly, is at the benefits of adding these materials to the soil from a micronutrient point of view and from a soil structure point of view.
Yeah. So this material would be spread on farmland, typically?
Yeah, and it is being spread on farmland in order to collect data and understand whether it benefits farmland. So like all of these mechanisms for adding things to soil, there's pros and cons, and that's what they're assessing.
And then the other big technology that gets talked about is biochar, which was all the rage about 15 years ago, and then it seemed to go quiet, and now it seems back on the agenda. But if perhaps you could introduce us to the theory behind biochar and then give us your views on it.
Yeah, so the theory behind biochar is that we can store biomass in the soil. So basically you take wood and you burn it in very little oxygen and create a recalcitrant form of carbon, which means a form of carbon which is not edible to the soil microbiome, but it does provide a nice surface for the soil microbiome to attach to. So there's some very exciting results with biochar. Personally, I think it's one of the tools that we've got in the toolkit. The problem with it that I have is that I'm yet to be convinced that, but maybe I haven't read the right papers, that it's something that the soil microbiome needs, but we do know that it increases the fertility of the soil because it holds on to nutrients. So again, with that mantra of carbon for soils, not soils for carbon, I think that many people are treating the soil as the dustbin that we have used it as in the past. As we can put stuff in the soil, you know, we put our rubbish, we landfill into the soil, and we put our waste onto the soil, but not to the benefit of soil. And I think that what's important is to turn that round and think, what is it that the soil microbiome is missing so that it can deliver the things that we want? Storing carbon is one of those things, storing water, etc., hosting biodiversity, because 59% of everything that's living on planet Earth lives in the soil, is another thing to remember. So biochar, I feel the biochar community has been very much in the mindset of, oh, we could add biochar to the soil and it can stay in the soil and it's storing carbon, instead of looking at what the microbiome is benefiting from.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, is that when it was first presented to me all those years ago, it was basically burning some wood and then putting the resulting charcoal type material, charred wood, in the soil so that it wouldn't break down in the atmosphere. But you're suggesting it will have an interaction then with the organic, the living part of the soil?
Absolutely, and I'm just looking forward to seeing the papers that come out on how it might interact with the microbiome. But we know from ancient soils in the Amazon, the terra preta soils, that people have done this for millennia. They have slashed and burned. They have created more fertility in the soils by adding charcoal. So it's clearly got a benefit for the soils. But I'm not sure that we've got all the answers yet for any of these soil amendment technologies.
Yeah. So there's a huge amount of interest now in farmers being able to sell carbon credits from these measures, whether it's different agricultural processes, whether things like biochar and enhanced rock weathering that we've discussed. But it all seems to hinge around the robustness of how you can sample the increased carbon in soil.
Absolutely, and I think the risk is all on the farmer. It's them who are going to have to show in 2030 or 2040 that they have successfully stabilised the carbon in the soil. So whether it's organic carbon that has been stuck to those mineral surfaces, things like iron oxide, or whether it's enhanced rock weathering where they're pulling carbon dioxide into the soil, or biochar where we're burning biomass and then adding the char to the soil. I think that the risk is all on the farmer, and the figures are people don't really know. The best, I think, paper on it is probably Lal's paper, Ratan Lal, who's very well respected and a bit of a god in the soil health world. He started a lot of this stuff off. He estimates that about 10% of carbon dioxide can be stored in the land. I think it's 5 to 15%, he says.
That's 10% of annual emissions.
Annual emissions, so about a gigaton of carbon.
Yeah. So there's a big prize there if we could get this right.
There is.
But it's difficult.
It's difficult, and we have to remember that it has to be the carbon for the soils, not soils for carbon. It's not about bunging carbon in there, it's about understanding the microbiome, and that's the energy source for the microbiome.
Right. So what you're basically saying is there's a huge opportunity, but you can't go for a one-size-fits-all sort of magic wand. We will do X and magically 10% of our global emissions will disappear. We've got to work with the soil as a living organism to make this happen.
Yeah, and it's personalised, it's locality specific, it's basically personalised soil health care.
Yeah. And you have a little twist on Roosevelt's famous statement that a nation that destroys its soil destroys itself.
Yes, we like to say a nation that rebuilds its soil rebuilds itself.
Maybe a planet that rebuilds its soil rebuilds itself.
Because definitely a planet that destroys its soil destroys itself. Yeah.
Yes, because this does seem very serious. Well, thanks very much for those insights into soil and carbon. That's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks, Grifter.
Do you fancy a cup of tea?
Yes.